Welcome to Fool's Gold with Cara Cordoni. The views and opinions expressed on Fool's Gold do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast, its host, or its producers. Any content provided by our guests, contributors, or authors represents their own opinions and experiences and is not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, or entity. Hi, welcome back to Fool's Gold, where we explore spiritual seeking, coercion, healing, and a path forward. I am your host, Cara Cordoni, and today I'm really excited to have guest Anke Richter, who is a journalist, a participant, and an activist in the space around all thing cults. And well, turn it to you so you can introduce yourself, Anka.
Kia ora from Aotearoa, New Zealand, Cara. This is how we say hello here. As you know, yes, I'm calling in from New Zealand. I am an international journalist. I've written the book Cult Trip. It came out a few years ago, and I now run a small advocacy organization called Decult, which organized the first cult awareness conference in this part of the world last year, and I'm doing the next one soon. So, yeah, I'm wearing a couple of hats, and I've also participated in ISTA, the International School of Temple Arts, for a number of years.
Which is what brings us together. And actually, how we met was through Facebook as part of advocacy. Back in 2022 now. And so let's bring our audience in on your journey. How did this all begin for you to even be exploring cults personally or as a journalist?
I think personally, I've always had an interest, even from the years when I lived in Los Angeles and met people who were in Scientology, and then Scientology was really big in Germany and very, very controversial there for a while. I'm from Germany, and I know there was a lot of pushback and even open discussions and organizations like Descartes here in New Zealand now, back then, warning about them. So I
Yeah.
was always interested in these kind of discourses around these more extremist but also fascinating groups. Didn't really see as some of the aspects that I see now. I always had them on my radar as a controversial, fascinating topic. And I've moved through a number of different communities myself, even as a young student, being, living in a Rudolf Steiner
Okay.
anthroposophical boarding school, being coming from that world, from being or dipping into that world for a while, even living on a small atoll in the South Pacific in a very Christian community where I was the doctor's wife, as my husband was the visiting doctor there for 7 months. So I think all these things have sort of shaped my interest, and then also going to alternative
Mm.
festivals and so on. And so in my 40s, and this is really, I think, where the hook was, and also the cult journalism started. In my late 40s, I attended a spiritual festival in Byron Bay called, oh God, it had a different name back then, but it's now called the Taste of Love Festival.
Mhm.
And I went there because I'd done another workshop earlier in New Zealand, which was called Awakening of Love,
Mm.
which was a sort of taster event for the Taste of Love, week long Osho based trainings. And my entry into even doing some of these workshops was more around dissatisfaction with some parts of my life and my sexuality, having some sort of midlife crisis, maybe themes to tackle. Lots of different things, but none of those that I then became really, really big later on when I got into Esther. So backtracking, went to this festival and met a woman there. Her name was Angie, who was a former kid from Centrepoint,
Oh, wow.
a historic sex cult here in New Zealand, where many, many kids had been harmed, and it was a So sex and therapy cult from the human potential movement. The founder had been to Bhagwan Osho Roshan's ashram in Pune, and he'd also been to Esalen in California. So there's a bit of crossover with your part of the world. And I met this former teenager who said she'd been the commune concubine in there. And I was fascinated by this whole story, didn't know anything about this cult, and started researching it and got so deep into it. It actually messed with me.
Mhm.
I had to stop the first draft of that book about Centerpoint 2 years in, a whole big investigation, which is a massive project to stop. I had a really good publisher, but I just couldn't go any further. There were legal threats, there were all sorts of issues. And then years later, it all morphed into the current book. But on a personal level, that festival where I met Angie was also where I had a sort of an epiphany, or I think a really a moment of where I thought it's a moment of no return. And it was when I was at an ecstatic dance session there. I think it was during the day, no drugs, no alcohol. I was just high on life and on these sparkly connections and on this freedom I was feeling and the, sensuality of this whole event and everything that's being discussed. And I just loved all these interactions. I didn't see anything dangerous, insidious, potentially harmful, manipulative in any of that because I was quite new to it.
Mhm.
And the cults that had been on my radar previously, like Scientology or whatever, I just didn't make that link at all. I was just high on all these people, and I felt very free because I was away from New Zealand. I wasn't, even though I ended up writing something under pseudonym later about this festival. I really was just there as a private person, exploring myself in ways that I hadn't before. And then this dance it's ecstatic dance. And I've been to ecstatic dances before, so I think it was a build-up of a lot that was in the mix and, eyes and bodies and just woof. And then I stepped outside on the balcony there. Byron Bay is very subtropical, and there was just a rain had just started, a tropical shower coming down, and I remember put my hands out to the rain from the balcony and these drops from my skin, and I was so sensual, and I felt so awake, and there was this moment where I thought, "This is how I always wanna be. I can't go
Yeah.
back to how I was before," and you might know this beautiful poem, I think it's from David Whyte, where it says, "Don't go back to sleep," yeah, in that
Mhm.
poem. I can't recite the whole thing, but I think it was something like this, like, I this is really me. There's so much of me that's coming alive here, and this is who I need to be, who I want to be. And now I found a community or something where they're offering things and courses and trainings and festivals where I can explore that. And it felt really wholesome to me and also ethical in the sense that, I'd explored other things in my sexuality around that time as well. And they often didn't feel like me or like what I really was looking for or what was giving me what I was, whether it's sort of, you know, s- yeah, don't have to go into the details, but you can probably imagine if you're a middle-aged woman sort of on a quest for her, let's just name it, for her orgasm, right? Very, very common problem, by the way, which, but at the time I felt like I was a bit of a freak and what could I do to fix this? And then suddenly I enter this world where this is discussed and explored in such a different way. And it just all shifted for me that I thought, okay, let's park this whole, quest. But here is something that's so much better. I've been hunting for this plastic out there, and here's the goal of more, better, deeper connections and fun and all of that. So, long story short, sorry if I'm making this too
This is
long, Cara,
beautiful.
but it was really a crucial moment. And actually, in fact, that whole festival. Met quite a few people there who I now see as highly problematic. There were some of the teachers there and offering sessions and hitting up women left and right. And at the time, it was still all not a big joke, but it was quite a few years before the Me Too movement.
Mhm.
So I was sort of thinking, it was just more normal for me that this was happening, and it kind of came with that territory.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and then a year later, I did my first training with ISTA in Australia, and this is where that journey began. While at the same time, I also started my research with the center point victims and trying to find people in New Zealand and beyond who told me their stories. And so it's interesting how these two things happened parallel. And now looking back, I think that my interest in center point probably came from me getting being interested in people who wanted to open up their relationships, who want to have some kind of healing with certain issues, who like going to workshops that are quite interactive, or maybe I know we don't want to use that word transformative anymore, air quotes, that are quite full on and have a high intensity, and who want to live in communities and all of that stuff. Because I only got my first taste from it back then in 2000, what was it, 12, 13. I hadn't been part of the esoteric scene at all. I hadn't done all these other workshops before. I was a bit of a latecomer, and therefore at that time it really worked for me. And then also with the center point research, I came in with that maybe more open mind of actually these people weren't all wrong wanting to live together and explore these things. And I think that helped my research because I wasn't, I didn't just have that sort of crime lens
Mm.
on what have they all done, but also what did they want? And why did this sort of beautiful utopian dream then turn into something so awful? Because they had police raids and a dozen people or so went to jail. And there is a lot of unresolved trauma, which I then found out.
Right. Right. What really stands out is the whatever kind of synchronicity it was that you didn't go to ISTA thinking there was anything problematic. It wasn't part of your journalist research. That this was your own exploration while you're as a journalist working on the Centerpoint story. And then at some point they converged down
Yeah.
down the line. But I think the other thing that you're expressing so well is so many of us are attracted because we have a need for connection, healing, more pleasure, play, um, all these things, the movement together, some might say ritual. It may not be a ritual, but there is something that we are yearning for that makes this so appealing. And I think it speaks to how different it is from our default world or our day to day. And so then it becomes in its own way, we keep chasing it because how do I have this in my day to day? How do I be so turned on or alive or whatever that is when that actually has ripples in my community? It's kind of weird, but when I'm with these people in this container, I can be all of that. And yeah.
It's you just pointed something. How can I have this in my everyday life? Because the irony, oh, I think the sticky point here is that, yeah, I went in there to have it in my daily life and bring some of that energy back. And of course, as you well know, you come out on this workshop high and you think, wow, this is amazing. And all my friends should be doing this too. And everyone who has any issues in their relationship life, they should all be doing this too. My husband actually did it too. Um, Before me actually, and we're both like, "Wow, this is amazing." And it's like we found this new sort of playground of self-development, and we became workshop tourists for a while, right? If I think back of those years where I went for holidays, because at the time our kids, were already old enough to, they were not necessarily coming on holidays with us anymore. So a lot of our trips overseas then became sort of workshop tourism trips. But it didn't necessarily really mean that it does filter back into your everyday life. And I think this is really the sticky point or the problem with a lot of those kind of trainings, not just with ISTA, that what actually happens is that I started, I actually was leading a bit of a double life. I
Mhm.
had a second Facebook profile. I think it's
Mhm.
called Eva, whatever. I'm not gonna give it all away. And that way, I could accept invitations to meetups and
Mhm.
trainings or events where I just didn't want to be seen in
Mhm.
my role as a journalist, obviously, but also with just a mum here in my community and a normal married person. I did realize that this could look really weird. At the same time, I wanted to be part of it. So I've almost created a, not a fake personality, but I did keep it hidden. And it was, and it, these two were my home life and especially my professional life didn't really merge with the other world. And a lot of my new friends were then all out, were all these Esther people. And to be fair, not many of them really are still friends these days. I can probably, name a handful of those, and they've all stepped back
Mhm.
as well for all their own reasons. So this whole, these instant friendships, there's this intensity, this, some of these beautiful connections that I've really cherished, and where I thought, oh, here's something that I cannot express with my normal sort of dinner party guests or school mums or what you sort of do when you go to a music gig and have a few drinks, and that's kind of your big night out. It didn't compare the normal mundane stuff didn't, and my life certainly isn't boring, and I have a lot of social life going on anyway. I wasn't like I was lost and lonely and needed some excitement,
Right.
but it was like mundane life, yeah, became mundane, couldn't really match that level of intensity anymore. And when it became so this drug that always pulled me in again. Oh, when could I book the next thing? And where could I go? And what's this teacher offering now? And what's the next level? And so on. And yeah, I'm not. I mean, it's embarrassing in some ways, owning that and admitting that.
Sure.
But I think I have to because here I am in my role as a journalist and advocate. I have to also, my one of my main sort of missions is to lift the shame
Mhm.
around that and to let people know that everyone's susceptible and people who join cults, air quotes here again, because no one, as you know, joins the cult, but a really good thing at first. We are not stupid, are not uneducated, are not lost souls, and I'm the living proof. Yeah, maybe I'm stupid, or I don't know. Someone, others might judge that, but I'm certainly an absolutely perfect example of even a cult journalist can fall into something that I now call a cult, which I didn't
Mhm.
see at the time, of course. So I kind of have to walk my talk
Mhm.
and can't just sort of have the whatever expert journalist head on and talk about survivors. I mean, I don't identify as a survivor because I have not been harmed in the way that others have in that time. I could look back and think, wow, how much money have I spent? How much time have I spent? How did I okay, actually I could talk about one thing maybe later that was pretty awful and dramatic, and now looking back, I think it is linked to my time in ISTA.
Mm.
But, even, to sort of the whole self-image of, yeah, I talk about cults, but I wasn't one of them. Well, you know, no, I'm not gonna bullshit myself. I was one of them. I
Mhm.
am one of them.
Mhm.
We're all in this
It
together, right?
it actually brings up a really interesting nuance or question kind of, when I've sat down to confront or try to mediate with ISTA or as survivors have gathered. And the question has been, we were ISTA. We didn't join a thing, but we spent money. We kept going. We stayed in touch with people. So that makes you ISTA. Um, and when the people started speaking up about harms, all of a sudden we're not ISTA community. And yet we are ISTA community because we went through the thing, but that kind of being rejected or like there's no tolerance, right, for that, and that becomes very confusing. Like I think part of me going into mediation and things was about some of my confusion about what I was dealing with. So the same way that you were like, I'm doing all this stuff and it's not a cult, even though I'm researching cults. I was similarly like, I've done a couple of retreats that were cults, but somehow this isn't a cult until, yeah, it really
Until it
is.
is.
Right, right.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about this a little bit because we're both in these interesting roles, right? And I think especially for me, because I mean, it wasn't planned in any way that there would be a Facebook group 2022. You know it well, and because you were involved with 3SC, and I was sort of more. and I was advising 3SC a little bit. I mean, it wasn't even 3SC at the time, but there
Right.
was a little chat group of some of us, and we're discussing this. But you were definitely, closer to it all. And this Facebook group had started issues with Eastern Haydn Temple, and it was like a bomb had gone off, at least in
Yes.
I guess in our world. And and my book was about to come out the same year. I think at that stage
Right.
it was written, it was edited. I mean, HarperCollins is, a very good publisher. It takes a long time. There was legalizing all of that. And I'm just trying to remember. I think I still managed to squeeze into something into the epilogue, just so where things are at with Esther. And by the way, a Facebook group had started and it's being discussed. So
Right.
that was the latest. Just then, not knowing where any of that would go and how big it would get. And then fast forward a few months later in, I think it was November here in New Zealand, and then a year later in the US, my book came out. And I wrote, some stories around it because, that's what you do as a journalist. You plug your book, you try and place some of your own articles related to the book. And so it was kind of went public for the first time in the mainstream media saying, oh yeah, this is all my research I did on these sex cults. And just to make it really clear, I was never a journalist researching ISTA. I
Right.
mean, I've since sort of definitely understand it. I understand a lot more. I'm aware of all the research that's been going on, but I was never undercover in ISTA. I'm not and I'm also not the ISTA survivor in that sense. I haven't been part
Right.
of any of these. I've never written a harm report. I haven't been, so my role has been more trying to help people to come together as a networker to figure out what to do, and if there's a media opportunity, maybe, check who, is this journalist legit and who should talk to them, and sort of be a bit of a go-between behind the scenes. But I've never been an ISTA activist in the sense of, some others who've tried to stop certain things from happening online or offline. And I've since also been attacked by some ISTA fanatics online, and that was quite confronting. And I've also had a little sort of legal intimidation behind the scenes
Yeah.
about from a well-known Israeli facilitator um, who had been at my house here with his wife many, many
Wow.
years ago. We were hosting them when I was still sort of in awe of all these amazing people. And I think, wow, how much my life has changed. That these are now the people who are, some of them are the worst perpetrators in that movement. And they still got some little hooks, or they had some little hooks on there, even those last years. And
Yeah.
that's been a interesting process of, first of all, putting some of my ISTA experience and my misgivings mainly, and my change from, my switch from or gradual procession from being this hooked in and intoxicated, enthusiastic participant to being disillusioned and pulling back, which also had to do with, by the way, with my cult research about another cult, namely Agama Yoga in Thailand.
Right.
I can come back to that later. And then it's still an ongoing process with every podcast I listen to, like yours, Cara, just a few weeks ago, and things I read and things I understand through the work I do with Decult.
Right.
It always helps me also to unpack a little bit more about where I'm at with Esther and how I position myself, how I feel about them, because it has been really, it has been quite hard. Even though I was never a facilitator, only an assistant wise, I wasn't as deeply in there as others. And also, as I said, I wasn't angry and harmed. It was more of a process of grief and disillusionment. I
Mm.
think, oh, I'm leaving this Garden of Eden that was so amazing, and then coming to terms with, well, that Garden of Eden, not sure how rotten everything there was, and seeing that. And then also still realizing how much some of these leaders that I've looked up to, I mean, especially one dude who I, always looked up to as, I mean, I never had a spiritual leader in my life, but I thought, oh, he's a wise man
Mm.
and his opinion counts. And there was some hook he still had in me for a long time where I was maybe afraid to be seen to say something publicly in that way about him or about Haydn Temple here in New Zealand. And I have friends who've been there and know people in my community in Christchurch who still go there and do training sets pretty close on some level. And then also is also moved away on
Mhm.
another level. And I found this distance and I found my place. And this is why we're talking here today, Cara. And it might be my most frank interview ever about Esther, because this is where I'm at right now. And a lot more has come to life.
Yeah.
and, to light, I mean, to live and to light. And you're in a new position too, and I think it's really good to compare some notes and, yeah, take note of where we're at and what a journey it's been,
I
yeah.
think it's super important, because like you, I consider myself a survivor, though I wasn't sexually assaulted, because I consider that my mind was fucked with, especially regarding the setup of the agreements and the impact of the agreements on interrelational dynamics. So that most of the agreements are ways of folding us on ourselves and disconnecting us from others. And, so I'm like, people get so much value, especially from level one, especially if you drop in once, especially if you have, um, I think a lot of support in your life and good relationships, then I think a lot of the negative impact of that washes off your back like a duck. I can't argue with people that say they went and it really transformed their lives because it opened up new parts, they had less shame, and, whether it's Centerpoint or ISTA, there is also this idea that by reducing sexual shame in the world, we will heal the world. We will, free people. And I think some of us, we have experiences of that. And then we're like, oh, this is what we can all, do together. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the ideas of what I thought ISTA stands for, and maybe sort of on paper and
mhm,
its best possible version, that still holds true. I share some of the, I share those aspirations and those ideas. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been there in the
exactly.
beginning. If I
Hmm.
hadn't believed that this can help us, this can help the world. I mean, it's a very grandiose, but
Yeah.
this can help a lot of people. And like you said, I've noticed for myself and also a lot of others, I thought, oh, they did ISTA and they loved it and it was good for them. And then I mean, I didn't really check in with them years later what has really come from that. I also know people who didn't do so great,
Hmm.
which I probably blocked out at the time and still had that typical ISTA thinking of, oh, they probably weren't the right kind of people, or they're not quite there yet, or maybe they're too whatever monogamous or stuck or too anxious, or they have too much trauma and whatever. But at the time, I did not have the language for that. I
Right.
didn't understand I didn't understand the inbuilt gaslighting. And you know what? Just as of today, I've actually had access to those, what is it called? It's almost like the assistant guidelines, the
Oh,
new assistant
oh,
guidelines for
yeah.
ISTA. Yeah. And I read them. I think it's a leaked document, so it's amazing what's been, what's come out of what the course materials and some stuff that certainly wasn't available back then. And it really took me back to when I was an assistant, and also my that which was my last ISTA training as well. And there was also that training that kind of sealed the deal a bit for me to step back afterwards. Do you want to hear about
Yeah,
it a
because 'cause
little
I'm so
bit?
curious about how, yeah,
Yeah.
you were enjoying that, you're writing the book, and then something happened.
What happened, right?
Yeah.
So nothing dramatic, but because I mean, I was obviously had skin in the game with the conscious sexuality field, and I also do yoga, and then was following B. Schofield, who you might know, the guru hunter. I had profiled her before, and then all of a sudden, all hell broke loose in the yoga world and the tantra world because the Gama yoga, all these reports fell into B. Schofield's hands about over 30 women being sexually abused by teachers there and the guru. This is a international yoga school at the time, was still quite big on the island of Koh Phangan in Thailand. I think they barely, managed to exist right now, and I wish they would close down. Anyway, it was a big story. The Guardian and actually me here for New Zealand and German media, and we blew them out of the water with some, a big investigations. And I actually flew there and was the only person on the ground after the guru. They had fled, and I spent quite a few weeks researching this and talking to victims. And then Copenhagen was actually my stopover on my way to Europe. I go there usually every year because I'm from there and visiting family. And as I said before, my workshop tourism, I combined it with another ISTA training in Devon, in the UK at the time. was all part of that trip in 2018, yeah, summer 2018. So I did all my gamma research, flew to England then, and went pretty much straight into the ISTA training. And what became, and while I was on Kopangana, I also learned that, what's his name? Ohad Ezra'i,
Yep.
the main dude in Israel who's since come under massive scrutiny and actually has rape allegations against him. As we can say that now, it's been established in very credible media.
Mhm.
And I also was in touch with one of the women who went to the police in Israel, and I've seen the report of her filing a complaint about the rape. So, yeah, I'm the journalist also who
Yeah.
has very
Direct
close
sources.
knowledge of that.
Right.
Exactly, right here. Anyway, this guy, who, yeah, had just bought or was going to buy land next to a Gama. He also, on Copenhagen, he and others like Eugene from Ista had also run courses there or are planning to, might not get the
Right.
timelines quite right here. Long story short, that's when the first time when it sort of dropped for me that, mm, one sex car is being chased off the island is the other one moving in, and the parallels suddenly became clearer. More parallels in the sense of because I was still enticed with Esther. I still thought Esther the good guys and Agama are the bad guys. And it's again very typical. I've seen this since we're always really good to spot the cult in
Yeah.
the other cults. And very good because it means that we can't be the cult because it's so obvious the others are. I've seen it with people, doing it towards landmark when they're in something that's very similar, but maybe not quite as, full on. So, came to my training in Devon and I thought, okay, I need to warn Esther here. I mean, this is straight from the horse's mouth. I am, apart from the Guardian journalist, we are the two people who really researched this case and blowing it out of the water. Um, I'm not quite sure if the stories had already launched then, the international media stories. Mine was, I think, maybe still in the making. But I had all the knowledge, I had all the insight, and I tried to approach the two lead facilitators. One of them has since left ISTA, and try to sort of bring this through as a friend, as someone who loves what they do
Yeah.
and respected their work, and said, "Hey, just so you know, I think if you don't want to end up as the next Agama, some things in ISTA need to change, like teachers sleeping with students." And they just don't wanna have a bar of it. It was basically like, "Anke, just be a good assistant, fill up the water bottles, make sure, everyone in your pod does what they're supposed to do, and don't come with." That was just the arrogance or maybe and again, the oblivion or the elitism
Yeah.
that and I've heard this again, I've heard this sense from other cults too, where people try to raise awareness from within, and because if people already think they're the best and no one and they've got it right, you can't. This doesn't land. So it's nothing compared to the kind of intervention that you guys tried later with 3SC. But in those days, just in a very very small way, I did try to have some of these conversations. I said,
Yeah.
look, you probably don't have that many journalists here doing ISTA trainings and assisting with you. This is a real opportunity for you to understand how the outside world, especially in the media, could see this.
Yeah.
And I had the same thoughts when I did one ISTA training at Hayden Temple in New Zealand as well with Des, and I was also assisting there. And I'll give you another background story to that soon as well. Um, and at that time, I also thought, oh my goodness, if my colleagues, and actually one really good friend of mine who is the investigator, or was the investigative Me Too journalist in New Zealand, then later, and I thought she lives close by in Fielding or lived there back then. I thought, oh my goodness, if any of my colleagues would come here and see this and even just drive past and see this sort of this building that looks like tantric Hogwarts and see these people running around the garden, screaming naked, hugging each other. I could just see the headlines, a tabloidy headline, and I wouldn't really blame any journalist for. But at the time, I thought, oh, but they would totally get the wrong end of the stick, and yes, they would because if unless you really understand the complexity and what it is, it's so easy to mock and shame it. And I always felt conflicted. I thought, oh god, I just don't want to be seen here. But I wasn't conflicted because I thought something bad's going on there and I shouldn't
Mm.
be there. I did not make that connection. Okay, so back to 2018, the Karma Yoga, and then over to Devon and in that training. And now here's the aha moment I had this morning when I read these assistant guidelines, and where it actually clearly said that if there's criticism in your pod and people, might even want to leave and don't want to do something, it is basically your role as an assistant to squash that down and keep them on track and not amplify that and make sure it doesn't get shared in the wider circle and so on. And I thought, that's exactly what happened in my pod. I had all the naysayers. I had those who were going, yeah, but I'm not comfortable. And are we really going to do that? And I sympathize with them. Maybe because I just come from Agama yoga and I
Mm,
already had that lens on, like, Esther needs to watch its back. Things are not going to look good for Esther if they have no self awareness. So I could see where some of these people were coming from that found it just too full on or came with this sort of outsider, fresh perspective. And I thought, these facilitators who are really respected and liked, to women and a guy as a third one, I thought they are just so deep in this world
mhm,
that they don't realize what a quote unquote normal person from the outside, what they think and feel when they come into this environment. They need to be a bit more aware. So I try
mm,
to bring that to the facilitators meetings, the assistant with facilitators meetings. And I was like, ugh, oh, that old chestnut. Seriously, I remember that because it really stung. Oh, that old chestnut. Just basically just sort of make sure that they get with the program and they don't cause trouble. And in fact, one person left from my pod. She left
oh,
halfway through.
ah,
So I was the worst assistant, of course. I did not, I didn't get the
oh,
top bad driver. I failed as an assistant because I was too sympathetic towards them. And I kind of, I was kind of in the middle of, yeah, I get it that they are struggling, but how can I mediate here between them and the facilitators?
mm,
That was not my role. My role was to bring them back on track. And I literally actually left one evening. I actually went outside of the main hall because someone had left, and it was all too much for them. And I was there to bring them back in. I mean, safety reasons as well, so they didn't don't hurt themselves in the dark or something. But it was very much they should be here with us in the room, and not
right,
you could go talk to them and go to their room with them. And again, at the time, all these things that we're now so aware of, the red flags and workshops and so, just wasn't really public yet or clear yet, or there weren't enough materials. And I guess this is what I'm doing. What I'm doing now, holding events, holding workshops, talking about red flags. Because if I'd known some of this earlier, if I'd had some cult education beyond investigating cults and the worst sort of case scenarios like rape and child sexual abuse, if I had known some of the more subtle dynamics, it would have clicked earlier for me
mhm,
that that's actually not okay, that what I'm involved with. And I was bringing a lot of people at the time into ISTA as
yeah,
well here in New Zealand. I think every training, someone was there because I said, "Oh, you should do that." Yeah. And they
right,
trusted me. So, yeah,
right.
that weighs on me too. Mm.
Yeah. Well, and I think that informs sometimes people are like, why do you speak out? Why do you care? And for me, it's the work I did in attempting mediation with ISTA of going to them with goodwill, similar to you being like, oh my gosh, you guys are driving off a cliff and you don't see it. And we want to help you because we love you. We actually believe in this stuff. And then realizing, "Oh, that's almost like me being as much as my bubble as they are in their bubble, because I'm not dealing with the reality of who they have been, who they continue to be, who they're determined to be." And yeah, just the goodwill of, saying, "Oh, we can influence don't sleep with students anymore." They said in level 1 they won't sleep with students anymore. They've created an accountability system. They pulled teachers out of circulation, right? Like, there's these little check boxes, and yet, when I step back and look at the what actually happened was they didn't fundamentally change. They didn't become not a cult and share power and take care of people and care about the larger community, not just who they're sucking in now and getting money from, but those of us that paid in the past and got hurt. And I speak especially because the whole point of that had been about survivors. And then when we went into negotiations, it was this process of where you're like, well, what can we get now? How do we reduce harm now? And we said, okay, if we can reduce harm, more people aren't getting shoved out the back, damaged. And yet, in that shuffle, the people who had already been harmed, they said they set up mediation services. They said they set up, and then I trusted that. I went through that. I have spoken with 3, 4, 5, 7 people who've been through that, and it failed. It failed survivors. And so I'm like, if I've spent 2 years trying to help them change, and yet that actually bought them 2 years to, like, not do substantial change and then whitewash themselves, I'm like, I out of integrity, I'm on the hook for at least 2 years to explain what actually happened and to see if I can recenter survivors and say, ISTA has money in the bank, and we've got 3 survivors that you and I have both spoken and more who haven't worked. Like, I don't know that people understand that the impact. People have not worked for 2 or 3 years. People have been in psychiatric institutes. People are in active PTSD 3 years after, even though they're trying to get support, even though they're seeing a therapist and doing, like, and so, the 2 years it took me when the Facebook group started, and I did mediation while I was a bloody mess, you know? And I laugh. I mean, I like that we're working with all the nuances of it, right? It's like there's nuances on both sides. There's complexities, um, and
You've been incredibly brave, honestly. Can I just say? Sorry to cut in, but I just want to say how courageous you are and how much I admire watching your whole journey from starting that mediation. And I know you copped a lot of flack for that.
Mhm.
And I wasn't always sort of happy how some things, were handled in the process. And I pulled back from it
Yeah.
as, your quote unquote media advisor at some point. And then watched more from the sidelines. And I'll just see you the integrity and also, like you said, the toll it takes and your integrity and finding yourself quite alone in some ways because not everyone who started off with you has seen it through in the same ways. And maybe some people had their moment in the
Mhm.
limelight, others were worn out and burned out. I mean, you know that better than me.
Yeah.
But I just want to say I'm really, really grateful, dear Cara, that you are here and that you're doing this. And then now and you're doing this in such a well-informed way from so many angles because not many people who've been in those, who've been in the mediation room with Esther for so long and then came out saying, fuck this shit. Yeah, we've given them the benefit of the doubt. We
Yeah.
really tried. We copped a lot of flack from the more
Yeah.
hardcore activists for helping with the whitewashing, and actually now they're throwing us, under the bus. I
It
hope I'm getting this
it's
right and not
accurate.
misrepresenting you,
Yeah,
but
and I think, some of the ironies are, um, of well, like, there's this process of A, kind of going back to the person that harmed you and continually trying to work it out, and when you're dealing with narcissistic traits or self-centered people, you're never going to get that satisfaction, right? And so there's that piece where I'm like, oh, on a personal level, I've done this in certain kind of relationships. Here it was on an organizational level, I got the same stuff. The other part is that it was about idealism as much as ISTA is about an ideal. Also, as 3SC, Safer Sex Positive and Spiritual Communities came together, there was an ideal that we stand for transformative justice. We stand for the opportunities to do calling in. We stand for a non-punitive system.
Mm.
That's a beautiful ideological stance, and it doesn't hold water in certain conditions, and
Exactly,
that's what
exactly. It depends on the
it
conditions,
depends
right?
on the
Yeah, yeah,
conditions. You can't do it with
yes,
a psychopath, a
yeah.
narcissist, or a cult. And so it's funny because I look now and I'm like, "Oh, you're trying to reinvent the wheel." And there were ways I couldn't receive the feedback to say, "Honey, you're trying to reinvent the wheel." And I'm like, "No, I have to prove it. I have to do it for myself."
You
And
have the proof now because of
yes.
how Esther reacted. It's almost the
Yes,
proof's in the pudding.
yes, it
The way
is.
how they've come back from the New York Magazine article, from interacting with you guys at the end, from the little I know, but you know that better, of course. I think it's almost like now, if there's any doubt before that they were very culty, well, or that they are a cult, however, wherever you want to draw the line. It's not about just putting a C word on someone, right? But that they're not dealing in the ethical way that they claim that they're dealing, or with the accountability level they claim they're having. Well, you clearly have that proof now. And I hope in some ways, even though it's frustrating to think how many years you've actually spent, trying to quote unquote make them better, at least you're kind of on the right. You know that you really tried, and now you have the proof. And I have news for you, because with Agama yoga, for instance, and I've since learned this from many cults, we often only sort of see the tip of the iceberg when things go really bad, and abusers, end up being caught out publicly, or even end up being arrested. Often not. Unfortunately, not often enough,
Right,
but at least there's some kind of shitstorm. But what we often don't see is the years, usually years, sometimes decades, that have been going on in the background. Pretty much, I mean, with a lot of organizations where people are already aware of the harm, and some people are really trying to change the organization from within because they love the community. They've built a life there. They raise their kids there. That's where they make their money, where they, so many different scenarios of why you're there, and you actually believe in the good stuff that the school could still be teaching, but you just see how awful the leader has become when you want to save people from, him, raping another woman or damaging the reputation of the school. And this has been happening again and again and again in so many organizations. And I've
mhm,
followed this really closely in my research with Agama Yoga, when people, had meetings and town hall meetings and wrote letters and had talks and tried all sorts of things to change things from within. And again, they were fobbed off, and there were false promises, and nothing really happened. And that really wears people out as well. And then they leave, and that's
it
insidious.
is.
And we often don't know how much goes on within cults. So again, this whole old stereotype of, oh, why don't people just leave? Why don't they just speak up? And if it's so clear, well, first of all, it's not always that clear. And then secondly, people often do speak up from within, and then they give up, and then they're defeated, and they leave with nothing. And they know they can't really go to the police to, for half of the stuff that 90% of the stuff that we know is wrong in those groups. And I'm just observing this firsthand with a alleged rape victim from Easter, who was in the New York Magazine article, and her attempts to find justice, even for a rape case where you're dealing with on the outside with authorities and levels of complications and international law and whatnot. I mean, even if you have something as awful and as kind of clear cut as a rape, it is still really, really difficult to take that somewhere to set some kind of legal process in motion. So, yeah, I think this whole topic of how can you change the cults from within, I would say you can't. If it's a cult, you can't. If it's not a cult, yeah, try. But it will be the litmus
Well,
tester.
it is, and I mean, I think of Carol Murchison, and I when I met with her, the lawyer, the cult ninja, and
Yeah.
I was kinda hanging my head, "Carol, I spent 2 years trying to change it, I feel like such a fool," and she was like, "Oh, honey, I spent 4 years trying to change the first one I ran into." She was like
There you
she
go.
was
Wow.
and so that's also the network of having these conversations and reducing the shame so we can suffer less, because when we're together, we do alleviate each other's suffering, right? Because the shame is such a heavy blanket, and cults prey on shame and or leverage shame, and then the whole misogynistic system or patriarchal system we're in has had the victim carry the shame, right? So we're in this whole flipping of that to be like, no, 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 no. We need to put the shame where it belongs, on the racist system, the misogynistic, so the patriarchal system, and not on individual survivors and
Yeah.
victims.
But but there's a catch-22, Cara, with all this, because our society is not exactly healthy or as evolved as probably you and I would like it to be in terms of sexuality,
Yeah.
right? There is work to do. Obviously, I mean, where to even start, right?
Right.
Because of these levels of patriarchy, of misogyny, of sexism, of porn culture, of lack of, communication, all of that, this is why people go into their sacred sexuality spaces because they want
Absolutely.
to find something better. And then they're being harmed in their sacred sexuality spaces, but because of this not so perfect system on the outside, which we all want to change, especially as feminists and so on, and sex positive people, because of the problems that still prevail on the outside, they can't address the harm or find the justice that they've suffered because there is no language, there's no understanding, there's mocking and shaming and laughing, even with police officers
Right.
when they go and they say, "Oh, I booked myself onto this week-long conscious sexual what course and what did you do? And you took your clothes off and there were group rituals where you did what with a carrot?" Where do we even begin? Even if you
Right.
have, if even if you overcome your shame and embarrassment, but just the lack of understanding in a legal and professional sense of that. And this is why, just also bring it back to what I'm doing now, the cult education is
Yes.
so important. The public awareness,
Yes.
not just that, yeah, there are cults out there and they're bad. I think most people kind of clocking that by now, but also you, me, and everyone could already be in one without knowing. And also, what are the complexities? What are the nuances? How do we actually help people who've been harmed to come out and find healing and justice and yeah, and to do this work that you and I are currently doing unpaid. Yes.
Right. I
Mm.
do think about, for example, ISTA having their scholarship fund for younger people, 19 to 24. Maybe they've changed it 21 now. I think they might have gotten out of the teens, but I could go check. Um, and, I'm 52, you're in your 50s. Like, I you were in your
It's okay.
50s. No. um, my sense of outrage, or my part of my passion, is that nobody was able to help me navigate that or safeguard that. And I get it. If I'd been attracted as a 19-year-old, I probably would have done all the things and rose all the ranks based on my psychology, my idealism, all the reasons. And that these are vulnerable people in particular, and then to target them, and that kind of, grooming or indoctrination process that happens. Come be an assistant. The assistants are the culture of ISTA. The assistants are the fluffers of the temple. The assistants, right, are and that's actually where it becomes particularly, I would say, where the cultiness begins. If you just come as a participant, there are implications, but when you pay bonus to be a worker bee, and that, I think that's where the hooks actually start coming, because you see, those internal dynamics. And so, between the survivors that contact me who don't have the capacity to be a public voice, many of them suffered much more physical and emotional harm than I did. And so I'm like, oh, I can be that icebreaker or that voice by staying
Yeah.
in touch with you, and recentering. And for then these young women and young men, these beautiful, vulnerable, big-hearted, curious, um, so many beautiful people come. They're attracted. And so I'm like, how can I help you avoid this? But then also, where do you go? Right? That ends up being the question, is where can we do this? And so I think that's part of the education too, is like, are you looking for smaller groups? Are you, right, avoiding some formats of the large group awareness training that are gonna entrance or entrain your system a certain way? Um, yeah, and then just this education that you're doing, like, literally for a whole region of the world, with Decult, and then that reaches internationally. as well. And so, yeah, your passion around education.
I think it's really interesting how I can now pull a few things together, just of late, really, because this year I've also done a an in-depth interview with a survivor, former teenager from Rajneeshpura. You
Oh,
know,
right.
everyone was watched Wild Wild Country in Oregon. The crazy Bhagwan Osho, you know, they rebranded himself as Osho Bhagwan Rajneesh, his commune in Oregon, where a lot of stuff went down. And like center point, and I wasn't able really to put those dots together before. It was very similar to center point in terms of the early sexualization
Mm.
of kids and girls 13, 12 years old who were sleeping with guys much older. And it was not just accepted, it was, you know, they were cool because of that. Within they climbed the ranks, the hierarchy in that
It was
sense. So
status.
again, it gave them more status, exactly. And of course, as in a lot of those cults, no parents, parental neglect, the community raises the child. In fact, the family bonds need to be broken because it holds you back from your spiritual development and all these compounding factors that enable the abuse, even if it's not like a, you know, part of the doctrine to sleep with underage, you know, kids and minors and teenagers, but it kind of comes with the territory, and it's all in the mix and goes unchecked. And um and pulling all this together, so the historical sex cult research that I've done for many years, and also how it affected me, you know, because some of that trauma is so big that's still out there. And it was shocking to hear what some of these former teenagers suffered. And then to see that replicated in the Osho movement, and then the same silencing that's still happening years, decades later, when they finally speak up, because some of them are now mums themselves and are wondering, hang on, you know, this happened to me when I was 12. And the silencing that's still there, and the spiritual bypassing, and this old, you know, the old chestnut, which you're well aware of, oh, it's always on you. It's always on you if something else happens. They're no victims. Don't be in a victim consciousness. Don't be stuck in that. Yeah. See it as a gift. Here's a way to grow. But you were so happy. But this was just done with love. And it's just the same old toxic bullshit that we see in all these spaces. And it does worry me in terms of ISTA, to be honest.
Mm.
Um, when they start having youth trainings now, and whatever, you know, sort of branching out and families coming together, and especially when it's live-in communities where there are kids as well. So what does that mean if you, let's say, and I'm actually quoting a real life example here that I know from Haydn Temple in New Zealand. What if you, as a participant who's really loving everything there and wants to fit in and thinks this is the thing, you observe something that is completely off in some, or for you feels off. A parent and a child in a, you know, in a sexual setting, maybe. Let's put it just like that. That to you would feel inappropriate or at least weird. And instead of going, actually, maybe I should talk to them about that, or what was that? And you question yourself because you had a contraction, as they call it, and a contraction. And the teachings of Haydn and so many of these other, you know, mystery schools and Neo Tantra schools, it means that you have a blockage that needs to be overcome, and you have to work. You basically have to work harder so you don't feel appalled or disturbed or disgusted by what you just observed. And this is a key thing to understand, because if you look at so much of the cult carnage, even from, you know, from Johnstown to the Manson family, the extremes, to all the very common child sexual abuse, and from Christian cults to everywhere, but especially in those new agey ones. If this is what you're being, how you're being brainwashed and taught, that a resistance to, you know, to what your inner, what your intuition or your moral compass teaches you needs to be overcome, then what does that lead to? And my conclusion is a lot of good people at Centerpoint, for instance, did some pretty awful things and had, you know, some kind of sexual interactions with kids, probably more because they thought they should do, or because what would normally help them hold them back wasn't holding them back anymore because they could just put it aside. And they could just go for what they, had the hots for, whether it's legal or morally right or not, or ethical, all of that.
Right.
And that's for me is really what I wanted to talk to you with about. That we can really let's identify that thing as
Yeah.
a pretty bad thing, and how to, and especially if you're in a somatic sort of, a school where it's all about embodiment and feeling the stuff in your body. So yeah, you're actually feeling something. It's great, but then the brain fuckery of, excuse my language, but of being at the same time having learned and being taught and being modeled that, oh, but that's a contraction means that can't be good and you need to move off. You overcome that. I hope my point is clear
It
and why this really, really concerns me.
it is, and it comes up with One Taste with Nicole Daedone on her
Yes,
way to her
exactly.
prison term. Um, aversion aversion it's not aversion therapy, but they use an aversion practice to say, "Ooh, you should be turned on all the time. You should get off on any stroke." And that means if you feel repulsed by this person that we've asked you to go do a thing with, you should lean into that. That is a problem of yours. And I feel ISTA does the same thing, like with level 2 and the spread your legs like a temple
Cosmic
whore.
war.
Yeah,
Mm.
and this
Even
idea
with the nature. Oh, sorry. No, you go.
well, and just this idea that when you get into transpersonal or you get into the void, you have no discernment because you are not your personality. You are now the essence of love or the archetype of the divine feminine. And so if my adoption or performance or accessing this idea of the divine temple priestess, like, yeah, I was emitting love everywhere. Did that mean that I wanted to have physical interactions with anybody who approached me? No, but am I shamed for that? Because what's my problem if I'm all love and right? And that the growing edge, that's the other piece they'll use is like, well, of course, growing means being uncomfortable. And so if you're defaulting for comfort, then you're not really in it and you're not really growing.
Oh, yeah, they even tell you that story, right? I'm sure you've heard it. It's a classic and most Eastern courses. You gotta go hear the story of the cafe on
But
the edge of the cliff,
yes,
right? And it's, if I get it right, it's like the spiritual seekers, they all meet there. It's this lovely little parable, and they, to really be enlightened, involved, evolve, take the risk, which of course risk taking and
yep,
and being edgy, all of that is a big Esther thing, and that gives you more status, and because Esther already is edgy and risky, and you do stuff that other tantric schools wouldn't do, like throwing sex in the mix and all that. And if you hang around too long at the edge, and you just have another coffee at the cafe at the edge of the cliff, you're never going to make that jump. And what they're basically telling you, you're a loser if you don't jump. So, I mean, it's so insidious. I just remember one little example here too from my very, very first ISTA course. So here I am, arrived at the Yarra Valley outside of Melbourne. I think it was 2012, 13, maybe. Never done anything like this before. I mean, was like, oh God, I'm going on this week-long course with all these strangers, and we're probably going to take our clothes off, and some things might happen. My husband had already done the course, so I actually knew a few things. I thought, oh God, I'm going to do that with people I don't know. And I remember we all arrived where they were picking us up with a bus or a shuttle at a bus stop. And there were some people who just arrived from somewhere else in Australia. And there was this guy, I think he owned a fish and chip shop, and I think he spent the night on the park bench, and he kind of looked the part. He was quite a big belly, and it was cooked a bit greasy, and I mean, he was the sweetest guy, don't get me wrong, but just sort of his physicality at the time, I was like, "Oh god, I'm going to do something maybe naked intimate with this person? Oh
right.
god, yeah, please, no, please don't." And guess what? Because of the nature selection, you know what I mean? Where when you do the first ritual a few days later, and you have the nature selection where basically you can't choose the partner who you're doing something super intimate with, namely a so-called sacred spot massage. Um, you can't choose them. They're being, you allocated a person just by sort of selecting a little thing out of a hat or yeah, whether it was a leave or whatever. We know the process. I guess most of your listeners would know as well. And it was that guy who was doing this ritual for me. Yeah, I was the
Right.
receiver, and I thought, oh no. And but you know what? What I could do then, I just projected because he was so not the Adonis I was probably hoping for too. And back then I was still more in that mindset of I was so conditioned to any sort of physical intimacy like that, which had only really happened in my marriage between me and my husband until then. I just it was kind of hard to separate us from this is not a hookup. This is not this
Right.
is just an exercise. So I had, of course, hoped for someone, not as a hookup, but more like someone I would actually feel attracted to so that it would
Yeah.
make me feel better doing this. But then I kind of switched around and thought, okay, I can project all my anger or frustration or whatever I have, or my yuck, my disgust on this poor guy's big belly and sort of let it all out and scream it out. So in that sense, it was almost a bit therapeutic. But looking back, I also think it's kind of messed up because I was trying to condition myself also away from, something I wouldn't have chosen and I didn't like, and where I had a physical repulsion. Yeah. And to
Mm,
not, I had to somehow find a way mentally to get around that big obstacle of I'm really physically don't like this guy and he would be in the last one I would have chosen. Do you know what I
right.
mean? So
Absolutely.
there's a problem right there from the start. Yeah.
Absolutely. Fantastic. We're going to wrap up for today. I could talk to you for so long. There's so much
We
more
could.
to explore. Are there any last thoughts, things you want to share with folks before we wrap up for this round?
Yeah. I mean, of course, I would here. I'm just gonna hold up
Yes.
my book. It's not my first book. It's actually my last book I've written for. This one is my book in English, and it came out a few years ago, and I think it's still making the rounds in lots of ways. Cult Trip. It's called Cult Trip. Came out HarperCollins. You can also listen to it on Audible, and it's a very personal. It's my very personal story. It's kind of like gonzo journalism. You're watching me as I do all this research and it's pretty confronting at times. So yeah, I want to just put that out there that there is a book about all this too. And then of course there's my little organization called Decart, which you find online, decart.net, and we're running another Cart Awareness conference next year, which anyone can watch on live stream and also live on Zoom in your time zones in the States and in Europe. So it's going to be incredible
Amazing.
event with speakers from all around the world. And my own website is Anke Richter, my name, .net, Anke Richter.net. And yeah, please get in touch if, through my website or so, if you have any questions or if you'd like me to talk more about this. It is a big topic and I'm really glad we did it, Cara.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anka. Thank you to everybody who's been listening to us. Would love to hear if you have thoughts, questions, ideas, reflections, and that you'll join us next time for the next episode of Fool's Gold. Bye. This episode was recorded at Access Humboldt and produced by Paxton Scarberry, Shanti Chakravarti, and John Friedman. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.